The night Eric Richins died didn't begin with violence. There was no scream, no forced entry, no sign that anything was wrong. Just a quiet home, a husband, and a drink that would never be questioned until it was too late. What makes this case disturbing isn't just the death, it's what came after. Because while investigators were still trying to understand how a healthy man could suddenly collapse, the person closest to him, the one who claimed to be grieving the most, was already telling a different story to the world. Her name is Kouri Richins. To neighbors, she was a devoted mother. To friends, she was building a future. And to the public, she would soon become something even more unexpected: an author. A children's book about grief. A story meant to help kids cope with the loss of a loved one. A story inspired, she said, by the sudden death of her husband. A story filled with warmth, healing, and heartbreak. But behind the pages of that book, investigators would later uncover something far darker, something calculated, something that didn't read like grief at all, but like a carefully constructed cover. Because as sympathy grew, so did suspicion. Phone records, financial pressure, unanswered questions about the night Eric died, and one chilling detail that refused to go away: the presence of fentanyl, a powerful and deadly substance found in his system. This wasn't just a tragic loss anymore. It was a potential murder. And the woman who stood in front of cameras, speaking softly about pain and healing, was now at the center of a case that would shock the nation. A wife, a mother, an author, and possibly something else entirely. This is a story where grief may have been staged, where love may have been a lie, and where the truth took far longer to surface than anyone expected. The first signs that something wasn't right didn't come from the night Eric Richins died. They came from the days that followed. Quiet details that didn't quite fit. Small inconsistencies that lingered just long enough to make investigators uneasy. At first, everything looked like a tragedy. Eric was found unresponsive in his home. No signs of struggle, no immediate explanation. For a man described as healthy, active, and cautious about his lifestyle, the suddenness of his death was shocking, but not, at least on the surface, suspicious enough to trigger alarm. His wife, Kouri Richins, told a simple story. She said she had prepared a drink for him that evening, a Moscow Mule, something casual, something ordinary, the kind of detail that feels too small to question. According to her, Eric had enjoyed the drink, gone to bed, and that was it. By morning, he was gone. A devastating loss, a grieving wife, 3 children without their father. And for a moment, people believed it. Friends gathered, neighbors expressed sympathy. The narrative settled quickly. A young family, shattered by an unexpected death. And Kouri leaned into that narrative with visible emotion. She spoke about love, about loss, about the unbearable silence that follows when someone you care about is suddenly no longer there. But grief, as investigators know, has patterns, and sometimes it has cracks. Not long after Eric's death, toxicology results came back, and what they revealed changed everything. There was fentanyl in his system, not a trace, not an accidental exposure, a lethal amount. Fentanyl isn't something that appears by chance. It doesn't slip unnoticed into a person's life without a trail. It's powerful, fast-acting, and often fatal. And for someone like Eric, who had no known history of drug use, the presence of fentanyl raised immediate and urgent questions. How did it get there? That question would become the center of everything, because once investigators started asking it, the story began to shift. They went back to that night, back to the drink, back to the last person who had seen Eric alive, Kouri. At first, her account remained steady. She repeated the same timeline, the same calm explanation. But as detectives pressed further, they began to uncover details that didn't align with a grieving spouse caught in sudden loss. There were reports, subtle at first, that Eric was wary, that he had expressed concerns about trust within their marriage, that financial matters between the couple were not as stable as they appeared from the outside. Money has a way of complicating grief, And in this case, it introduced motive. Investigators discovered that Kouri had been dealing with financial pressure, debts, business struggles, and real estate issues that were quietly building behind the scenes. To the public, she projected stability, but internally, things were far more fragile. Then came another detail: a life insurance policy. Eric's death wasn't just emotional, it carried financial implications, significant ones. And when that fact entered the investigation, the tone shifted from curiosity to suspicion. Still, suspicion isn't proof. Detectives needed something more concrete, something that connected the presence of fentanyl to a deliberate act, something that turned a tragic death into a criminal case. That's when digital evidence started to surface. Text messages, phone activity, patterns of communication that pointed towards something hidden beneath the surface. Investigators traced conversations that suggested Kouri had been attempting to obtain substances that were not just dangerous, but potentially lethal. And suddenly the timeline tightened. This wasn't about a random exposure anymore. This was about access, intent, opportunity. The kind of elements that, when combined, begin to form a very different story. One where the drink Eric consumed that night wasn't just a casual gesture, but possibly the final step in a carefully planned act. As the investigation deepened, those close to the couple began to re-examine what they thought they knew. Moments that once felt ordinary now carried new weight. Conversations that seemed harmless began to feel loaded with meaning. Had there been warning signs? Or had everything been hidden in plain sight? Kouri, meanwhile, continued to present herself as a grieving widow. She spoke publicly, she shared her pain, and then, in a move that would shock even seasoned investigators, she took her story one step further. She wrote a book, a children's book about grief. It was framed as a way to help her children process the loss of their father, a healing tool, a message of comfort. And to the outside world, it seemed almost admirable, a mother turning her pain into something meaningful. But to those watching the case closely, it felt different. Too soon, too composed, too calculated. Because while the book told a story about loss, investigators were beginning to uncover a story about something entirely else: control, planning, and a death that may have been anything but natural. By the time authorities decided to act, the image of a grieving wife had already taken hold in the public's mind. But behind closed doors, the evidence was stacking up, piece by piece, detail by detail. And when the moment finally came, when charges were filed, it didn't just change the direction of the case, it shattered the illusion completely. Because now the woman who had written about grief was being accused of causing it. And the question that remained wasn't just how Eric Richins died, it was why. By the time the case against Kouri Richins moved forward, it was no longer built on suspicion alone. Investigators had something far more dangerous: connections. Links between actions, timelines, and intent that began to form a narrative prosecutors believed a jury would understand. But cases like this aren't just about what happened. They're about what can be proven. And proving that a wife deliberately poisoned her husband required more than a toxicology report. It required a story backed by evidence so precise, so undeniable, that it could withstand every attempt to tear it apart. That process began with the digital trail. Phones rarely lie. They store conversations, searches, patterns, tiny fragments of truth that, when pieced together, reveal what people try to hide. In this case, investigators zeroed in on messages that suggested Kouri had been in contact with individuals who could supply illicit substances. At first glance, the messages were coded, vague, the kind of conversations designed to avoid direct implication. But under scrutiny, the meaning became clearer. There were discussions about acquiring something powerful, something that could not be easily traced, something like fentanyl. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they found that these communications didn't happen randomly. They occurred in the weeks leading up to Eric's death. Not months before, not after, right before. That timing mattered because it suggested planning. And planning changes everything. Then came the financial evidence. Behind the image of a stable family life was a different reality: mounting pressure, Reports indicated that Kouri was dealing with significant financial strain tied to business ventures and property deals that weren't going as planned. Money was tight, expectations were high, and according to investigators, that pressure may have been building to a breaking point. They also uncovered details about Eric's financial decisions that may have complicated things even further. There were indications he had taken steps to protect his assets, moves that could limit access or control, moves that, if true, could have created tension behind closed doors. And tension, when combined with desperation, can become motive. Prosecutors would later argue that this wasn't a sudden act, it wasn't impulsive, it was calculated, driven by a combination of financial gain and personal conflict. But the defense had a different story. They pushed back against the idea of intent. They questioned the reliability of the digital evidence, suggesting that interpretation doesn't always equal truth. Messages can be misunderstood, context can be distorted, and in a case built heavily on circumstantial links, doubt becomes a powerful weapon. They also raised questions about the investigation itself. Were assumptions made too early? Did investigators focus too heavily on one narrative while overlooking others? Could there have been another explanation for the fentanyl? Because in a courtroom, possibilities matter, even unlikely ones. Still, the prosecution continued building their case, layer by layer. They introduced witness testimony, people who spoke about the couple's relationship, about shifts in behavior, about things that didn't seem right in hindsight. No single statement was enough on its own, but together they painted a picture. A marriage that wasn't as stable as it appeared, a situation that may have been unraveling long before Eric died. And then, of course, there was the book. The children's book that had once drawn sympathy now became a focal point of controversy. Prosecutors didn't just present it as a coincidence, they framed it as part of a larger pattern, an attempt to shape perception, to control the narrative before questions could even be asked. The timing of its release became critical, because while investigators were still working to determine how Eric died, Kouri was already telling the world how to grieve him. To some, it felt like strength. To others, it felt like strategy. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom became a battleground of interpretation. Every piece of evidence, every message, every decision was dissected from two opposing angles. Was this the behavior of a grieving wife trying to cope, or the actions of someone carefully managing the aftermath of a crime? The jury had to decide, and it wasn't a simple decision, because this wasn't a case with a single undeniable moment. There was no video, no direct witness to the act itself, no confession. What there was a pattern, a sequence of events that, according to the prosecution, pointed in one direction and one direction only, toward guilt. But patterns can be deceptive. They can look clear from a distance, only to blur under close examination. And the defense worked to create that blur, introducing doubt wherever they could, challenging assumptions, and reminding the jury of one critical principle. If there is reasonable doubt, there must be acquittal. As the days passed, the tension in the courtroom grew heavier. Each argument brought the case closer to its conclusion. Each piece of evidence pushed the narrative further toward a final, irreversible judgment. And outside the courtroom, the public watched closely. Because this case had become more than a legal battle. It was a story that touched on trust, betrayal, and the unsettling possibility that someone could live two completely different lives at once. One visible to the world, and one hidden beneath it. A loving mother, a grieving widow, and, according to prosecutors, a calculated killer. When the time came for closing arguments, both sides laid out their final versions of the truth, one built on connection and motive, the other on doubt and interpretation. The jury would soon decide which version they believed. And with that decision, everything would change. The room was silent when the jury returned. Not the kind of silence that feels calm, but the kind that presses down on everyone at once, heavy, anticipating, final. Because after weeks of testimony, arguments, and unraveling narratives, everything now came down to a single moment, a decision. For Kouri Richins, this was the moment where two versions of her life would collide: the image she had presented to the world and the story prosecutors had carefully constructed in court. They couldn't both be true. As the four persons stood, you could feel the shift in the room. Every movement seemed louder, every breath more noticeable. The weight of what was about to be said hung in the air like a storm that had been building for months. Then the verdict was read. Guilty. The word landed with a kind of finality that no argument could undo. For some in the courtroom, it confirmed what they had come to believe, that Eric Richins' death was not a tragic accident, but a deliberate act. For others, it raised new questions about doubt, about interpretation, about whether justice had truly been served. But for Kouri, the outcome was immediate and irreversible. The narrative she had lived behind, the grieving widow, the author, the mother trying to guide her children through loss, collapsed under the weight of that single word: guilty. And yet, even in that moment, the case didn't feel finished. Because a verdict answers one question, but often leaves others behind. Why? It's the question that lingers long after courtrooms empty, the one that doesn't always have a clear answer, even when the facts seem settled. Prosecutors had offered their explanation: financial pressure, control, a calculated plan, a motive built on strain and opportunity. But human behavior is rarely that simple. What turns tension into action? What transforms conflict into something irreversible? And how does someone move from sharing a life with another person to allegedly ending it? Those questions don't fit neatly into evidence exhibits or closing arguments. They exist in the spaces between facts. In this case, those spaces were filled with contradictions. A woman who wrote a book about helping children cope with grief while standing accused of causing that very grief. A public image built on empathy, contrasted with allegations of calculated harm. A story that even after a conviction felt almost impossible to fully reconcile. As sentencing approached, the focus shifted again. Now it wasn't about determining guilt, it was about determining consequence. And that process brought its own kind of tension. Because sentencing isn't just a legal procedure, it's a moment where impact is measured, where the court considers not only the crime, but its ripple effects, the lives altered, the family left behind, the children at the center of it all. 3 children. 3 lives permanently shaped by a loss that now carried a very different meaning. The court would hear about Eric, who he was, how he lived, what he meant to those around him. His voice, absent throughout the trial, would finally be represented through the words of others. And Kouri's future would be weighed against that absence. How do you measure a life taken? How do you assign time, punishment, consequence to something that can't be undone? There are no perfect answers, only decisions. Outside the courtroom, the case continued to echo. It became a reference point in conversations about trust, about relationships, about the unsettling reality that danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from within the places we feel safest, from the people we believe we know best. And perhaps that's what makes this story so disturbing. Not just the crime itself, but the duality of it. The idea that someone can present one version of themselves to the world while living another in private. That truth can be layered, hidden beneath appearances, waiting for the right moment, or the wrong one to surface. In the end, the case of Kouri Richins isn't just about a verdict. It's about perception. About how easily narratives can be shaped, and how difficult it can be to see beyond those narratives. Because for a time, the story was simple. A wife grieving her husband, a mother helping her children heal. But as the evidence revealed, that story may have been incomplete, or worse, intentionally written that way. And now, with the verdict delivered and sentencing underway, what remains is not just the outcome, but the lasting question that continues to follow this case. How well do we really know the people closest to us?